Chapter 2. A lot had happened in the previous year of my life. I'd destroyed one starship and helped to capture two more. I'd met a girl I really liked, who happened to be covered with fur and come from another planet. And I'd made some amazing friends, and we'd done incredible things together. I'd discovered that my father, whom I believed to be dead, was really alive, a prisoner on an alien colony world, and that, perhaps most surprisingly, which I know is saying a lot, he had changed his appearance so he now resembled the DC Comics hero Martian Manhunter. I'd faced the knowledge that my mother was going to die from a horrible disease, and then, against all odds, I'd returned from space with a stolen treatment. It had cured her completely, and that was just about the only part of my story that had a happy ending. After all I'd been through, I really wanted 7th grade to be a little easier than 6th. Some things were different now, for sure. A few times a day I'd see a black sedan cruise past our house. Its purpose was so obvious, it may as well have had U.S. government stamped on the side. My mother and I presumed our house was bugged, our calls recorded, and our computer activity monitored. We didn't like it, but there was nothing to be done. We had to accept surveillance as a fact of life. If the government was really interested in how many times per week I clicked the SF signal, they were welcome to that information. After I'd returned in disgrace from the ancient space station, I'd been scheduled to live on for a year, which I'd been kicked off of less than 2 months after arriving. I was locked up for another few months while government people interrogated me and tried to learn everything they could about the alien technology I'd encountered. As lockups go, it wasn't that bad. There were no orange jumpsuits or hardened criminals threatening to stab me with sporks. I was in a secret government facility, completely separated from any other prisoners. The rooms were comfortable enough, and my jailers let me have access to a computer, a television, and a tablet, with a decent budget for buying books and comics. It would have been like vacation, except for the loneliness. Oh, and the daily debriefings, which is government speak for being asked the same questions over and over again. I also didn't like being separated from my mother and my friends, and I spent most of my time alone and underground, which I guess is the government's subtle way of reminding you you're trapped. Once a day, they would take me up to a fenced yard so I could get some air and walk around. My geeky hope that I was being held in Area 51, the government's alleged secret base somewhere in southern Nevada, was crushed during my first excursion topside. The landscape looked more like the Northeast. I was allowed brief phone calls and visits with my mom. She was even flown in and allowed to stay elsewhere on the compound, the location of which they kept secret from her as well. Somewhere else on the grounds were Charles, Niana, and Misan, the other humans who had gone into space with me, but they didn't let us see or speak with one another. When we'd first left Earth together, I hadn't gotten along with them, but by the time we'd stolen a ship, broken into an alien prison, and cheated death in a space battle, we'd become pretty tight. The government agents wouldn't let me communicate with them, because they thought it might contaminate our statements, but I felt pretty sure we'd end up telling the same story no matter what. I saw no point in lying or embellishing any of the facts. I told them the truth, and I kept telling them because they kept asking. The man doing most of the interrogation was a sinewy army officer with a full head of metallic gray hair cut in classic military sharp angles. He wore a perfectly pressed uniform, and his face was twisted in a permanent scowl. The scar that ran from his left eye to the left corner of his mouth didn't do much to make him look friendlier. Neither did the patch over his right eye. His name, and I promise I'm not making this up, was Colonel Richard Rage. I had a hard time getting past this in our first meeting. That's not really your name, I insisted. I was sitting in a warm interrogation room with nothing but a metal table, a couple of folding chairs, a slowly turning ceiling fan, and a sweating can of orange soda, which I guess was supposed to make me feel relaxed. Colonel Rage scowled at me. "Why can't that be my name? Do you know something about my identity? Did the aliens provide you with intelligence regarding United States military personnel?" "No," I insisted, happy to assure him he was not, unknown even to him, an alien sleeper agent. "It's just that you've got the, I gestured towards my own eye. "Like Nick Fury. Rage, Fury." I stopped talking because he was staring at me like I was spouting gibberish. In all fairness, I guess I kind of was. "Who is this Nick Fury?" demanded Colonel Rage. "Was he on the space station with you?" I held my hands up in disbelief. Nick Fury, I insisted, like it needed no more explanation. Former World War II commando, now director of S.H.I.E.L.D. You don't really seem like a comics reader, but you must have seen the Avengers, the Samuel L. Jackson character. What is that, a movie? He demanded in a voice that suggested he was about to make me do push-ups. I don't have time for movies, son. I'm trying to safeguard the United States of America. I remember this exchange fondly as one of the warmest and most sentimental exchanges during our time together. Eventually, they let me go, and while I wasn't exactly enjoying life in government lockup, I also was not too eager for it to end. It meant closing the book on my extraordinary life and going back to an ordinary one. While I was still trapped in the government phantom zone, I could convince myself I could get back there somehow, find a way to return to Confederation Central and deal with my unfinished business. Being sent home would mean admitting that it was all over. I was never going back, and that meant I was never going to honor the promise I made. I have an idea, I told Colonel Rage the day before I was scheduled to be blindfolded and taken to a helicopter, which would take me to an airplane, the location of which I was not authorized to know. Why don't we put together some kind of, institute? Set me up with Charles and Niana and me son, and we'll get some scientists. We might be able to reverse engineer some of the technology we encountered on the station. Negative, the colonel barked. The last thing we want is to put a bunch of children in charge of developing alien technology. Your friends have already been shipped out, and they've been placed on a watch list. If they attempt to enter the United States, they will be arrested immediately. You may not call, write, or otherwise communicate with these people, or we will consider it a national security threat. I stood there, stunned and angry, sending my friends away without letting me say goodbye, and telling me I couldn't stay in touch with them was like, well, it was like smacking me with a plasma wand. It was one thing to be told I had to keep everything I'd experienced a secret, but it was another to have the government prevent me from speaking to the only people in the world who were in on the secret. The colonel must have seen how upset I was, because he actually softened. Son, I know it's tough, but this is for your own protection. A lot of dangerous people would love to learn what you and your friends know. We're trying to erase any connection between you and your time away, because that's what will keep you from being abducted and interrogated by criminals or terrorists who would have no problem torturing you to learn about ray guns and spaceships. You understand? I did understand. Life in the Confederations of United Planets had been very different from Earth. It was full of advanced technology, but populated by strangely naive beings who mostly never thought to break laws or bend rules or try to game the system. A bunch of troublemakers from primitive planets, that is, me and my friends, had been able to take advantage of the society's relatively unfamiliarity with crime. Here it would be a different story. I'd be in serious danger if someone really bad decided they wanted to learn what I knew, let alone if the Confederation's enemies, the Fads, came looking for revenge. So it was back to life as an ordinary kid for me. My mother's new job took us to the suburbs of Boulder, Colorado, and it was nice there, but I was not in the best frame of mind to be a good sport. Somewhere, countless light years away from Earth, was a girl I'd met, and she was in trouble, alone and helpless on her homeworld. Tamrat, who looked like a white furred cat person, and Steve, who was basically an upright Komodo dragon with a Cockney accent, had been the best friends I'd ever had. I missed both of them every day, but Steve was going to be fine. He would go back to his family and his life as a good-natured and unrepentant hooligan. But not Tamrat. I knew that the rest of her delegation to the Confederation blamed her for getting kicked off the station, and they were right in that it was her fault, but only because Tamrat had also been instrumental in helping us rescue my father and capture ships belonging to the warlike and pretty much straight-up villainous Fads. For decades, the Fads and the Confederation had been locked in a struggle that had been balanced by the Fads' superior weaponry and the Confederation's superior defenses. The balance had begun to shift, and I'd learned it was only a matter of time before the Fads conquered the Confederation. But then my friends and I changed all that. We delivered exactly what the Confederation needed to hold off an inevitable defeat at the hands of the enemies. So even though we broke a few rules, we figured the beings in charge would give us a break. Instead, they gave us the boot. Before she'd been selected to represent Rarl, her planet, on Confederation Central. Tamret had been in real trouble. Casteless, which apparently was a bad thing to be in her society, and in prison for hacking. On the space station, she'd been harassed and threatened by Ardov, a boy from her world, who'd taken a sick pleasure in pushing her around. Now she was back there with him, and probably with Rarls a whole lot worse. And no one was there to protect her. Tamret was the sort of girl who usually didn't need protecting, who was about as good at taking care of herself as anyone I'd ever met, but she'd been terrified at the thought of going home. I had promised her that I would come for her, that I would save her, and I'd meant it at the time. But now I couldn't imagine what I'd been thinking. I had no idea what I thought I could do against an entire planet. But even that was besides the point. Unless someone came and gave me a ride in a spaceship, I was stuck on Earth for good, light years away. Tamret was alone and scared, and waiting for me to honor my promise. Every second I was stuck in Boulder, I was letting her down. When the government finally released me, it was almost the end of the spring semester. There was no point in trying to pick up somewhere for the last few weeks. It was maybe the only time in my life that the idea of an early summer break didn't seem like a reason to celebrate. I spent the months before starting my new school mostly moping around, although my mother would have preferred I use the time catching up on schoolwork I'd missed. The government had smoothed things over by falsifying my records so I wouldn't have to repeat 6th grade, but I was going to be behind and do pathetically if I didn't review. I found it hard to care, though. I felt too miserable to brush up on the wonders of dividing fractions or study the rise of ancient civilizations, which I knew pretty well already, having already gone through my standard dorky kid interest in Greek and Roman culture. My science study sheet included a ton of material on the solar system. There were pictures of Jupiter in my review material, but I didn't need to look at those. I had seen Jupiter up close. My mom was sympathetic, but she couldn't understand how much I'd lost. She had her son back. She learned her long-presumed husband was alive, and she was no longer dying of a degenerative neurological disease. "Come on," she would say to me. "It's not so bad." My mom would come home from work and tell me that I looked sad, that I should get out there and meet some new friends, as though all you had to do was stick your head out the door and friends would come running. I knew it wasn't so easy, and even if it were, I wouldn't have wanted to do it. Being happy would have felt like a betrayal. One afternoon, I was laying around the house flipping channels on the TV. I'd never been much of a channel flipper, but I found it was too hard to concentrate on books and comics and games. My life was pretty much one day following another, then school would start, and I would worry about grades, because they would matter to my mother, even if I was unlikely to care the way I used to. I changed the channel and was distracted, for a little while at least, when I came across Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. It had always been my father's favorite Star Trek movie, probably his favorite science fiction movie. When I was little, before he disappeared, I watched it with him more times than I could count, and he knew most of the whole thing by heart. I figured this would distract me for a few minutes, but I ended up catching only the final act, when Spock dies to save the ship, followed by lots of intense moments. Kirk's reconciliation with his son, and worst of all, Spock's funeral. When Kirk broke down during his eulogy, of all the souls I have encountered in my travels, his was the most human. I couldn't take it anymore, and I turned the TV off. I went to my room, which still didn't feel like mine, even though it had all my stuff in there. I threw myself on the bed and stared at the ceiling, which was glowing a sad sort of pink. Okay, I thought, maybe it's not a sad pink. Maybe it's just pink, and the sad part comes from me being a complete mope. Then it occurred to me that the ceiling should not be glowing any sort of color, pink or otherwise, happy or sad. I sat up, and it turned out it wasn't just the ceiling that was pink. It was everything. And it wasn't sad, it was scary, because while pink is a perfectly fine color, and I have no objection to it, I don't want it to dominate the entire world. Realistically, I considered it was unlikely that pink was plotting an evil scheme to force all of the other colors to bow to its will. Maybe it was my eyes or my brain. Maybe I was having some kind of seizure or blood clot or something equally terrifying. I held out my hand and looked at it to see if it was any less pink, but it wasn't. I thought about texting my mother to ask her if the world had gone pink for her too, but if it hadn't, my question would freak her out, and if it had, it would mean we were facing some kind of pink apocalypse, and that would freak me out. No course of action that ends in an inevitable freakout is worth pursuing. Then, everything went back to normal, which was good. Then a voice said, "I appear to be embedded in your brain." And in fact, the voice was coming from inside my own skull. That was less good.